Well, as many of you know, you may recall that in addition to the great changes and transitions that I've had in my life over the past year and a half, as many of us have experienced quite some tumult, I decided to add to that, or I would like to say God decided to add to that, starting a PhD program online last month. And I am greatly enjoying that program. I love the classes that I'm taking this semester. But I have discovered something that I wasn't expecting. I don't know what exactly I was expecting because I've never done any kind of, any part of my schooling online. My master's degree, when I graduated almost 15 years ago, we still turned in hard copies of everything. So that officially qualifies as ancient, the before era. And so this was all really new to me, and learning how to use the learning management system and the modules and the shells and all of the special words that come with that kind of thing. But I kind of assumed that this would be a pretty solitary activity, that I would do my reading, that I would watch things online, that I would then turn in things and maybe have hopefully some correspondence, some contact with professors. But what I discovered is actually a whole community. It wasn't necessarily one that I was looking for, but I discovered, in fact, that there are other people like me. You know, people who are a little bit idealistic and who just won't accept the world as it is and insist on pointing toward a better world. People who, acknowledge and know and see the reality of the messed upness. And in fact, many of us work in the midst of the messed upness every day, working with people who need help, working with people who are in trouble, working with people who have made poor choices, people who have not experienced love and acceptance. And yet, this group of people, we get each other. And I felt like I'd found a second home. I wasn't alone. There are people just like me. That was a surprising discovery, as I said. I wasn't necessarily looking for that or thinking that that was going to be a part of it. But it's been wonderful. I don't know if you have had an experience like that where you finally found your people and your heart was like, oh, yes, it is so good to be loved and accepted. And like every good thing, like every strength or advantage in the world, taken to an extreme, it can become a weakness, a shortcoming, something not so good. If we have been lucky enough to find those little groups of people like us and make a home, a little community bubble where everyone thinks like us and acts like us and looks like us, and it feels so comfortable in our little bubble. We can overdo that. We can get too comfortable in our bubble and refuse to leave the bubble. Or forget that there are many, many people beyond our bubble who we are called to be in relationship with. We may get so happy to be in our bubble that we don't ever push beyond or try to expand our bubble. And I wondered what Jesus would say about this. Certainly he preached God's love for everyone, and I'm certain that he is pleased when we find people who love, accept, and encourage us. But I think he also does things a little bit differently than is usually considered wise here on earth. And we're following this book by Tom Berlin called Reckless Love, and we're just on our second week now. And in this book, Tom takes us down an interesting path and said, instead of looking at the disciples as a uniform group, which I would say has probably been my tendency, we don't tend to give a lot of thought to what their group dynamics might have been, who they were as individuals and as individuals in relationship with each other. And so let's do that for a moment. Well, let me just talk about how Jesus picked those people first. So if I were the Messiah and I was going to reveal my time has come and begin a intense 3-year journey to change the world, I would assemble my A-team, right? I would pick the most talented people. I would pick people with certain gifts and what those gifts would bring to the team. And I would try to put together a team of people who could work well together and who had all of the different gifts and talents we were going to need, and that we would be a force to be reckoned with. You've probably not read that in the Bible, because that is not at all how Jesus went about picking his A-team. In fact, it looks a little sloppy. His strategy seems a little odd, but Jesus didn't pick people for what they would bring to the team, for the value that they would add, or what he could use them for. Jesus picked people for what he could do in their lives, for what he could show them, for what they needed. And there's different orders in the different gospel stories, and they don't all line up. There's been many people who've tried to reconcile all four, and it is, I'm just going to say, pretty much a fruitless effort. They don't match up, so don't freak out and try to get them to line up. So, different storytellers sometimes tell the story different ways. And in Luke's gospel, he shows that Jesus calls Simon, the one he would name Peter first. That he sees Peter fishing, and he calls out to him, and he shows him something unexpected and calls him to follow him. And he drops his nets, and he comes, and there are fishermen with him, brothers James and John, in another boat. They were known as the sons of Zebedee, but Jesus gave them a nickname too, Sons of Thunder. And I take it that means, in context and given what we know about them from some other sources, that they were known for having some sibling rivalry, for maybe having a short fuse, for tending to get in arguments, mostly with each other, but perhaps that spilled out with others as well. So far he's got kind of a rough trio here. And then in Luke's gospel, Jesus calls Simon Peter's brother Andrew. In Mark, actually, it shows Andrew coming first and then inviting Peter. That's interesting. But in either case, it is known that Andrew was first a follower of John the Baptist. So I wonder what that tells us about Andrew's ideas and personality, that perhaps, was he one of those people who's just a groupie? You know, they have to have a cause, and they'll follow this one until that one, and I don't know. But that seems a bit of a different personality. Then we don't know much about some of the others. Philip, we know that Andrew goes and gets Philip because he's from the same town, and then Philip goes and gets Nathanael, and Nathanael's the one that Jesus says that there is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit. So we know we have one pretty straight arrow, one who calls it like it is, who follows the rule book, does things on the straight and narrow. And that, given who we've just heard about, might make for, an interesting combination. But that's not all. Then Jesus calls Levi, or in Matthew's gospel, Matthew. And that happens, according to Luke, we're going to look at chapter 5, verses 27 through 32. There have been some teachings, some walking, some criticism, as per usual. Afterward, Jesus went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at a kiosk for collecting taxes. Jesus said to him, "Follow me." Levi got up, left everything behind, and followed him. Then Levi threw a great banquet for Jesus in his home. A large number of tax collectors and others sat down to eat with them. The Pharisees and their legal experts grumbled against his disciples. They said, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" And notice here, the disciples don't get a chance to answer. And I'm very curious what they would have said. But instead, Jesus answered, "Healthy people don't need a doctor, but sick people do. I didn't come to call righteous people, but sinners to change their hearts and lives." Let us hear what the Spirit is saying to God's people.
Thanks be to God.
So, So he calls a tax collector. Let's let this sink in for a minute. Tax collectors, then as now, probably not the most popular people, not the most appreciated occupation. In fact, it was pretty evident the other week when we had that national night out. I met several people from the Comanche County Courthouse and people who worked there, and one of them introduced herself and she said, well, and I work in the tax office. And I said, oh, the popular one. And they, nodded and grinned. It's not popular now to be a tax collector either. I mean, nobody loves paying taxes, or at least I haven't found anybody yet who does. But in their time, in the first century, in Palestine, there was a whole other layer to it. Because not only was collecting taxes not a fun thing to do, and paying taxes was not a particularly, appreciated chore, the tax collectors worked for the oppressors. Not the government that had been elected from the people, but an outside group who had come in, conquered the area, said, you're welcome, we'll provide the security, you just owe us some money. Great arrangement. They thought it was fine, but a lot of others did not appreciate this arrangement. They didn't ask to be conquered. And so you can imagine that someone from the community who was already not seen in the best light, working for the enemy, cooperating with the oppressors. Some, at that time, even considered that treason. Some had some pretty strong feelings, and some, I would include Simon the Zealot. Jesus also calls him. Now, he's not called Simon the Zealot just to differentiate him from Simon who becomes Peter, although that is helpful because it can be very confusing. But Simon the Zealot also doesn't mean that he was just a really enthusiastic guy. It meant that he was part of a particular religious political party called the Zealots. The Zealots believed very strongly that these conquerors, that these Romans had no right to be there. And they felt that violence was the appropriate solution. So Simon would be ready to go to war at a moment's notice for his people. I wonder what happened when Levi and Simon the Zealot got seated next to each other at the dinner table. I imagine there might have been some fireworks. That is a group of people who not only would not have been seen hanging out together of their own choice, they did not like each other. By principle, they did not trust each other. That seems an inauspicious start to developing your team who's going to change the world, at least in my opinion. I bet there were some interesting events along their journey. And I wonder what each of the disciples' decision to follow Jesus, if they would have made that had they known who else was going to be on the team. I mean, sometimes that affects us. We want to know who else you have invited to the dinner party before we accept the invitation or not. I imagine the stakes are a little bit higher with what becomes a pretty intense 3-year camping trip. Very close quarters. And as Berlin points out, not a lot of showers. So, why? There has to be some explanation. Because Jesus doesn't do things sloppily or accidentally. Jesus is very intentional about his choices. And so Berlin came to the conclusion, and I concur, that this must have been part of the plan. That calling together this diverse group was not an inconvenience or an obstacle, but on purpose. That Jesus put people together, put the disciples together with people who would stretch them. And so, if that is the case, that Jesus, in his most intense teaching group, put people together who had pretty heated opposite opinions, who were from different backgrounds, who may have technically spoken the same language, but probably different accents for sure, different experiences altogether, different places in life. What does that say to us about our social circles, the people with whom we surround ourselves? Berlin comes up with an activity, a little exercise he calls a circle analysis. And I have created a little bit of homework for you this week. Shall you accept it? It will be available as you leave. I asked Dawn to have those available and pass those out as you exit today. But this will walk you through thinking through your closest relationships and how those go out to all the people that you know. And will guide you through looking at those specifically at the variety that you may find or not find. Because typically we keep our innermost circles very much like ourselves. People who think like we do and who have similar opinions, similar views on things, similar backgrounds, similar cultures, people who look and think and act like us, is typically how humans group up. And so, I would like us to look at that maybe in a different light and say, if Jesus was intentional about including variety, people who would challenge and stretch us, what might we do to expand our circles, to share life with people who are different, who come from very different places, who maybe think very different ways, who maybe disagree with you even vehemently on some things? So I'd like you to take a look at that this week and think about what might that do for your discipleship. And I wanted to share the ending of this chapter. Tom Berlin ends this chapter by encouraging us to look at our circles and expand the variety of people we find there, and reminding us that, indeed, Jesus did not tell the disciples who they were going to be spending their time with and even where they were going. He just said, follow. And the same is true of us when we start our journey with Christ. Jesus doesn't tell you where you are going or who you will have to love. If you had that information, you might never take the journey. But without those companions and without the journey, we will never become the people God intends us to be. We can learn to love the Lord our God with all our hearts, minds, souls, and strength, and love our neighbors as ourselves. Of course, it might be a bit of a wild ride. Now, to some of you, that may sound like a fun ride. To some of you, that may sound like a very scary ride that you would rather not jump on. The good news is Jesus meets us where we are, wherever that is. And then, if we are attuned to the Holy Spirit, Jesus often brings unexpected people into our lives. People we would maybe not choose to spend time with if it were just our choice. But often those people are the ones who make our lives richer, who stretch and strengthen us in our love of neighbor and self. So if you would like to be on this journey with us, we don't claim to have all the right answers or do everything the right way, but we're going to figure it out together. And if you are looking for a church home, we'd love for you to consider joining with us. If you want to do so, come and get in contact with me, or come up and share that with me, and we'll celebrate that decision together. And let's now stand and sing together before we leave.
Let them flow in shall be thy royal throne. Take my love, my Lord, I pour at thy feet its treasure store. Take myself and I will be ever only all for thee.
Receive this blessing as we go. May bread never be lacking on the table, for here you will find it. May Jesus embrace you when hope is gone through our bodies. May grace blow the winds of justice together with our voices. Amen.